Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast series by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm Giuseppe Porcaro, and I'm here, as usual, with Alicia Garcia-Herrero. Hi, Alicia.
Hello, Giuseppe.
And today we will speak about the local government debt that threatens China's economy. This episode is part of Zhonghua Mundus, our series about global China as seen from Europe, which includes as well our monthly newsletter under the same name. The link to subscribe is in the show notes. I'm happy to have with us, joining from Beijing, Michael Pettis, who is Professor of Finance at the Gonghua School of Management at Peking University in Beijing and a resident senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Hi, Michael. Thanks for joining the Sounds of Economics. How are you?
Very good. Thanks very much for inviting me.
Once known as one of China's most impoverished provinces, the mountainous region of Guizhou has, over the past decade, became famous for a different reason. It is home to some of the world's tallest bridges. From the 565 meters high Yugubeipan River Bridge that links Guizhou and the neighboring province Yunnan to the 32-meter high Pingdang Bridge that spans the Kado River Canyon, Guizhou investment in infrastructure has helped lift the province out of poverty, earning its special praise from President Xi Jinping. But the high ground has come with a high cost. Guizhou debt totaled something like 1.2 trillion RMB, something of the sort of 166 billion US dollars by the end of 2022. With a debt to gross domestic product ratio of 62%, it is one of the most indebted provinces in the country. Including off-balance sheet debt, the figure could be as high as 137%, according to some estimates. So the enormous amount of borrowing accumulated by China's provinces, much of it through opaque local government financing vehicles, investment companies that raise debt and build infrastructures on behalf of local governments, for instance, has become a huge problem for the world's second largest economy. And an increased tension between local and central governments over the debt comes as Beijing searches for new models of regional economic growth. Local government, typically sustained by funding from Beijing and the profits from land sales, have long been encouraged to borrow money to fund regional development. Michael, can you help us understand the origin of this development model and how it has evolved in the past decades?
Thanks, Giuseppe. I think Guizhou is a very interesting place to start, not because it's typical, but rather because it's an extreme illustration of the underlying problem in China. Guizhou does indeed have some spectacular bridges, as you mentioned. I believe 4 out of the 10 highest bridges in the world are in Guizhou, and nearly half of the 100 highest are in Guizhou. But it's important to understand that Guizhou is a very poor province. Officially, its per capita GDP is not much higher than that of Cambodia's. In fact, that the numbers are much worse. And I say this, you mentioned that Guizhou is seen as a province that's used infrastructure spending to lift it out of debt. And I think that's a very common misperception here in China. That's driven a lot of the infrastructure spending. There is this perception that spending in infrastructure is a way to make you richer. And that's not true. Spending on infrastructure is a cost. And it's a cost that's justified if that infrastructure leads to higher productivity among workers. So, for example, if you are underinvested relative to your ability to absorb investment productively, infrastructure spending or spending on investment generally will make you richer, not because of the spending on investment, but rather because that investment allows workers to be more productive. The problem is that we too often think that spending on infrastructure, investment generally, is what makes you richer. And that's not true. It's only if it's productive it accommodates the increase in wealth. It doesn't cause the increase in wealth. So what we saw in Guizhou as one of the poorest provinces in China was this decision that in order to make it rich, it should spend more than other provinces. But here's the problem. A region, a country, a province is not rich because it has a lot of investment per capita. It has a lot of investment per capita because it's rich. And it's rich because it has that set of institutions, political, business, financial, cultural, educational, legal, whatever you like, that allows workers and businesses to absorb capital more productively at a very, very high level. So you can't get richer by increasing investment. You get richer by increasing productivity. And you increase investment in order to accommodate the increase in productivity. What happened in Guizhou is that they increased investment far beyond the ability of local businesses and workers to absorb that investment productively. And as a result, they generated a lot of GDP growth, but they didn't generate underlying wealth for the economy. And here I apologize, my answer is already a little bit long, but I want to make a quick digression on what GDP growth is. We're often told that GDP is the measure of the value of goods and services produced by an economy. And of course, it's not. GDP is a proxy developed in England and the United States in the 1930s and 1940s to attempt to measure, to create some sort of proxy for that value of goods and services produced. And there are very important assumptions that underlie the use of GDP. One of the assumptions, which is never explicitly stated because in most Western economies it's unnecessary, one of the assumptions is that the economy operates under hard budget constraints, by which I mean if you engage in non-productive activity, you very quickly go bankrupt, your resources are redistributed, your assets are written down. So by definition, this GDP measure is not very useful in economies that have a significant portion of activity that operates under soft budget constraints, by which I mean you can engage in non-productive activity for years, even decades, but you never go bankrupt because you're always guaranteed liquidity through the banking system, right? And so this is why Guizhou is so important. It's shown us the limit of that model that says as long as you fund financing to entities that invest regardless of whether or not that investment is productive, you can generate sustainable growth. What Guizhou shows us is that it's not sustainable. At some point, the debt levels become so high that you have to stop the process. And when that happens, you get that rapid unraveling of growth.
Thank you, Michael. This is making this whole story much more clearer. I'm sure Alicia would like to add something on this overview that you're saying. And it's very interesting to note down how growth, which is quantified with an indicator such as GDP, not necessarily means that there is an effective and sustainable growth, but it might just be some kind of a measure on the accountability of the balance sheet that might be misleading sometimes. Alicia.
Yes, so first of all, Michael and I have long been much aligned as to what we thought were the issues with the Chinese economy, and I quite agree, therefore, with everything he said on what I would call the long shadow of debt accumulation in eventually on China's not today's world growth, but actually potential growth, and basically realizing that China is indeed in a deep structural deceleration. But going back to how this can be, how can we not notice by looking at GDP growth that we are in this, getting into this trap, if I may say, this growth trap? Well, we are starting to notice because beyond the role of investment in China's GDP growth, i.e. its contribution having been excessively important for so many years, we do see return on assets coming down aggressively. All the more so because it's not only about state-owned enterprises whose return on assets are low, but it's even private enterprises now whose return on assets are increasingly low. So in a way, we are already seeing what's the real impact of this excess investment or unproductive investment in the economy. In a way, we're already there. I think by now the model, the withdrawal model is clear beyond this podcast. I think it's becoming increasingly obvious for the whole, including within China. And I think that's what making this kind of very negative sentiment hit the economy, not the other way around. And as many say that it is because of the sentiment that China is not growing. No, the sentiment is a reflection of these structural problems that China is going through.
Well, and speaking about sentiment and perceptions, I mean, the stories that you're just highlighting are somehow very interlinked to the cases of corruption, which have been popping up all around the system since more than a decade. How do we obviously position such a development model based on big infrastructure with the whole corruption story, which has been unfolding in mainland China?
Well, I think, we're all opposed to corruption. It's a very inefficient form of transfer of income. But I think, we shouldn't overstate it. Corruption is bad for the economy when it leads to significant uncertainty. So, for example, if you know you can build the factory and you have to pay the mayor $1 million bribe, then you go ahead and build the factory. You include the bribe, in your expenses. The problem is when you pay the mayor $1 million bribe and then you start building your factory, and then the people in charge of the water demand a bribe and the labor unions demand a bribe. So there's a huge amount of uncertainty about that corruption. In China, I don't think that's really been the problem. And I don't think corruption is the main issue. I think the attack on corruption is very politically driven, because it's a necessary part of the centralization of power needed in order to resolve the problems that China faces. I think that's an important issue. The other point I would want to make, Giuseppe, is that's to reinforce what Alicia said. There's this big debate going on in the market, both inside China and outside China, whether the slowdown in China was caused by recent bad policies, by the recent lack of confidence, etc. And many people are saying that because it's easier to understand. But if I understand Alicia correctly, I completely agree with her. These bad policies and lack of confidence are not the cause of the slowdown. They are the result of the slowdown, which itself is a structural issue.
Thank you, Michael. You point out one very important aspect in this whole corruption story, which I wanted to delve on a little bit more for our listeners that might not be as acquainted with the internal workings, especially the political interplay between the central government and the provinces, and even the inner workings of the party itself. Because we've seen that province level politics has been closely linked to the national one. We've seen, for example, clamorous examples of removals of big names at provincial level. In 2017, Sun Jiancai, he was the Communist Party secretary of Chongqing, and he was expulsed by the party. And somehow what happens in the provinces matter a lot for the central government. So it seems to me that there is a little bit of weaponization of both this local development driven by infrastructure, the interplay with corruption, and so forth. It's like a little bit all entangled. And I'm not really sure that someone who is outside China can get a view about how these things are being interplayed with each other.
I think one of the most important misperceptions that foreigners have about China is that the decision-making process is highly centralized. It was highly centralized in the 1970s, but beginning in the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping began decentralizing it. So a lot of political power, economic power rests with local governments and local elites. And so I would argue that if you are trying to manage what's going to be a very difficult adjustment process for China, historically, when you look at other countries that have gone through this process, the ones that have managed it successfully are either robust democracies or highly centralized autocracies. And, if you believe that, this comes out of a research done by Darren Acemoglu, James Robinson, and a few others. If you believe that, then you would have argued that what Xi Jinping's administration needs to do is either become a democracy, which was always very unlikely, or to re-centralize power. And I think you could argue that, there's plenty of corruption in China, but I think you could argue that a lot of the focus on corruption is really part of the re-centralization of power that the Xi administration is undergoing.
And Alicia, there is a connection with these local government debts, the land sales, infrastructure projects, which also points in the direction to link this debt crisis to the real estate sector crisis, which we've been spoken about here at the Sound of Economics and which we have been writing about recently in the context of understanding China's slowdown. What is the interplay there?
Well, the interplay starts, in my opinion, with Wen Jiabao's pledge for stimulus in 2008, in which he basically lets the local governments do it for him, if I may say. Rather than, he announces like an aperitif, which is 4 trillion RMB in stimulus, but that's basically only the beginning. Yeah, I mean, this was kind of the open door for local governments to borrow at that time with bank loans. And immediately after, impact of the global financial crisis was basically minimized through that fiscal boost. Immediately after, shutting the door of the banks and allowing the local governments to go shadow banking, basically, wherever they wanted to. And that created this very complex and clearly hard to understand because we don't have much data relation between the developers, the local governments, and the shadow banking. The shadow banking looks like the moon, but it isn't the moon. In a way, the official banking sector or the financial sector, whether it's trust companies, even banks issuing wealth management products, behind which, off balance sheet, there is this developers borrowing and local governments in between. So, it's a very complex thing to understand, but at the end of the day, what this has allowed is for China to grow, in my humble opinion, above potential for years and years, thanks to this extra leverage that we would not see in central government debt, let alone official local government debt, but which was lingering there as off-balance sheet, basically, debt. And suddenly we discovered that public debt overall is much bigger than we thought, is around 100% of GDP. And suddenly we realized that China's fiscal space is so much more limited. But in a way, this was doomed to happen. We were just not watching this relation and this, excess of leverage in the real estate sector in particular, and to some extent in infrastructure. So that would be my answer.
And Michael, a few years ago, a little bit linking to what Alicia just said, you wrote in an article in the Financial Times that mainstream economists have long called for Beijing to improve China's market mechanisms, and they have deplored the rolling back of the private sector over the past decade. But you also say that despite years of supply side proposals and repeated reforms pledges, there has been little evidence of a substantial reversal in the trend towards a greater government control of the economy. So this shouldn't surprise anyone, you said, over the long term. Chinese growth might indeed benefit from a stronger private sector and a more market-oriented economy. Yet in the near and medium term, this approach, you say, will do almost nothing to address either the real causes of China's slowdown or its growing reliance on debt. Do you still believe in what you wrote back then, and how the growing reliance on debt should be addressed?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's even more obvious now than it was back then. You can divide the growth in the Chinese economy into what the Chinese call high quality growth, or what Xi Jinping himself, in an essay he wrote 3 years ago, called genuine growth, versus inflated growth. And the genuine growth is the sustainable growth, largely driven by business investment, which is in the aggregate productive, otherwise they would go out of business, consumption, and exports. And I would argue that growth in China probably doesn't exceed, it would cause GDP to grow by at most 2 to 3 percentage points. But to the extent that Beijing requires, for political reasons, higher growth rates of GDP. Now, bear in mind, this is not higher growth rates of economic performance. This is higher growth rates in economic activity, whether that activity is productive or not. So to the extent that Beijing required higher growth rates in economic activity, the only way to achieve those growth rates was by shifting an increasing portion of growth to the public sector or to entities like, until recently, like the property developers that received unlimited financing, because it was their activity that allowed Beijing to bridge the gap between the real growth rate and the politically acceptable growth rate. And the only way to do that is with an increase in debt, which is, I guess, something that 4 or 5 years ago, people like Alicia and I and a few others were talking about, but most people didn't see it as a problem. It was already a problem, but it wasn't viewed as a problem. So the only way to achieve those growth rates is with an increase in debt and a shifting of economic activity towards the public sector and towards the part of the economy that can operate under soft budget constraints. So that's why I argued back then that the shift in the economy away from the private sector towards the public sector was inevitable. And as long as Beijing has GDP growth rates, growth targets that substantially exceed the real underlying growth of the economy, it must continue. Now, that doesn't mean you can go on forever, because your debt capacity isn't infinite. It was always going to be the growth in debt, that limited the ability to continue following this growth model. And I would argue that in the last 2 to 3 years, the big change has been that everyone recognizes, inside and outside of Beijing, that debt has become a problem and it cannot continue growing at the rate at which it has been growing.
Alicia, another aspect which I think is very connected to what we are discussing about, it's the lack of investment on the demand side. You have all this debt which is being piled up on one hand, but then, for example, there is no policy for growing through consumption. Redistribution policies seem to be labeled negatively as welfarism in China at the moment. Don't you think that this is also an element we should put in this puzzle?
Yes, absolutely. Well, first, I really want to say that I love to have this podcast with Michael because I feel vindicated. He's making a lot of points that we've been making for a long time, including, first of all, that China was growing above potential. Second, that the unavoidable shift towards the public sector is more of a need in a way than only an ideological issue. So all of this is coming out in this podcast, and I think it's great.
It's not even a choice what you're both saying.
Yes.
It's not even a choice at the moment.
It's not even a choice. Not only, for many reasons. One is, who would produce at a rate of return of, say, 1%, if you were the private sector, in an economy that claims is growing at 6% in 2019? Why would you invest unless you're forced to, i.e. you're the public sector? So in a way, the whole thing, your puzzle, Giuseppe, starts adding up. So let me add to welfarism very quickly. I think the whole point here is that, yes, of course, we know China would have to consume more. Michael has been saying this for so long, to rebalance the economy. But you can't do that if you have these huge precautionary savings. If you want to lower them, you would need people to know that they don't need to save for things that the state should do for them, whether it's a pension, unemployment benefits, education, health, you name it. Then why not? Now, one could argue, welfarism, we don't like that idea. This is the Europeans spending money for no reason. It's not whatever. But I think the other reason, and it hits on the same point, is that where's the money to do this at this point in time? Had they done it years ago when debt was much, much smaller, I would say maybe. But now, can they do it when they're spending massively on military, on what they call economic affairs, which is basically subsidies, where's the money for that welfare? So maybe it's better to say we don't like welfareism than to say we don't have money for the welfare state. And that's the reality of the situation in China today. So everything trumps debt rather than economics anymore.
Well, and on this note, I would ask Michael, perhaps your thoughts about the future. I mean, how do you see this war situation that we described with the provinces accumulating debt, the consumption lagging on the other side, and so on? I mean, this all points to the overall narrative which we are reading a little bit everywhere now. We have been speaking about it with Alicia since quite a long time here at the Sounds of Economics, but now this has taken the proportion of being read in all mainstream newspapers and so forth. So how do you think the future is going to look like for China economy, given the elements that we have now in order to, I would say, not predict because we don't have the crystal ball, but at least trying to understand which is the direction of course?
Yeah, I think the key point is not so much prediction, but simply working out the imbalances in the model. And these were obvious 5 years ago. These were obvious 10 years ago. There's nothing new. So let me give you some arithmetical constraints. For a large economy, the growth in GDP has to be a function largely of the growth in investment and the growth in consumption. Net exports matter too, but net exports are very small. So China has an incredibly high investment share, incredibly low consumption share. Around the world, investment is about 25% of GDP. In high investing countries, it's around 30 to 34% of GDP. In China, it's 44% of GDP. It's incredibly high. Another way of thinking about that is that China is about 17% of global GDP. It's only 12% of global consumption, but it's an astonishing 30% of global investment. These are really high numbers. So just to make China a normal high investing country, which I think even that is, it should be a low investing country given the amount of overinvestment. But just to make China a normal high investing country, the growth rate in investment has to slow substantially. So that's your first arithmetic problem. If the growth in GDP is equal to basically the growth in consumption and the growth in investment, and the growth in investment has to slow substantially, then either GDP growth must slow substantially or consumption growth must surge. So how can we get consumption growth to surge? Again, that's very simple. You have to transfer income to the household sector because they're the ones mostly who consume. The problem that we don't focus on enough is that it's easy to transfer money to someone. The hard part is transferring from. And that's really where the discussion has to happen. If the household sector is to receive a larger share of GDP, and in China, households receive the lowest share of any major economy in the world, if they are to receive a higher share, then somebody, either business or government, must receive a lower share. Again, this is just arithmetic. And it shouldn't really be businesses because businesses are really what drive wealth creation in the economy. So ultimately, it has to be government. And in China, as you know, there are different governments. There's Beijing, there are the local governments, but even the local governments can be divided between the 6 and 7 provinces that are quite wealthy, that have manageable debt, and that have growing populations, and the remaining 24, 25 provinces that are very poor, have unsustainable debt burdens, and have contracting working populations. So these are all really political decisions. They're not economic decisions. Economically, I can tell you, anyone can tell you how to solve the problem. The real issue is these transfers ultimately are politically difficult to manage, and that's what China has to accomplish.
Thank you, Michael. And we could go on for more and more hours about that because, first of all, it is fascinating, but secondly, because it's extremely useful. And obviously, this is not the last conversation we're going to have on China growth model and the challenges attached around it. But unfortunately, this is all the time we have for this episode. So I would like to thank you, Michael and Alicia, for the conversation. And I would like also to remind our listeners that, as usual, they can read in open access all the analysis by our scholars on our website, www.bruegel.org. Alicia, Michael, thanks a lot. And thanks to our listeners for following us. Until next time, bye-bye.